on the owner side, what I hear a lot of is we might not be financially stable enough to retire. We're not sure that if we're not at the helm of this business, that it will succeed. And I hear, yeah. And then I also hear, we're really concerned about long-term care. And so those three really highlight some of those financial concerns on the owner side. He says debt is dumb. And every time I hear that, it breaks my heart. And here's why. Because debt is a tool.
Exactly.
Debt is a tool. So we can have good debt and we can have bad debt.
Exactly.
And so when I think about debt, what we want to do is we want to use good debt to advance us, and we want to minimize that bad debt.
Welcome to the Farm Family Harmony podcast. I'm Elaine, Froese, Farm Family Coach, here with another episode full of transition tips, tactics, and sometimes hard truths to get harmony on your farm. Hey folks, it's Elaine Froese here, Farm Family Coach, on episode 29 of the Farm Family Harmony podcast. And I just want to do a quick shout out to my new running buddy. Her name's Elaine, and she sent me a lovely note on X and saying, Elaine, I love listening to your podcast while I'm running in BC. So thanks very much for that, Elaine. And also another shout out to Anna, who wrote in from the US and said it's been transformational in helping her deal with a lot of her transition journey with a small farm and with her parent. So that's really great to have your feedback. And again, I love to get mail. I really love cards and I love flowers. So I've got my glads from the farm behind me in my frame on Zoom today. But most of all, I'm really excited to welcome Jessic Groskopf with me. And she is a regional extension ag economist from the University of Nebraska. So Jessica, just tell us about the work you do for the University of Nebraska and what you do on your farm.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Elaine. This is like a dream come true. You know that I look up to you very much. But my day-to-day is that I help farmers and ranchers on the business side of their operations, and that includes pharmacy and transition planning. And I've been blessed to do that for almost 12 years now. And in addition to that work, I always say that's my 9 to 5, but my 5 to 9 is that I'm married to a farmer and we farm corn and dry edible beans here in western Nebraska.
And you just told me you just turned the irrigation off. So now you're in that waiting period for your harvest. You still have lots of things to do. And on our farm, I'm happy to report we're recording this around the middle of September and we're half done, but the oats are going through the combine pretty tough. So everybody's happy when we're in this season, but we're also happy to see the finish line. So Jessica, I first met you through our work together with some of the University of Nebraska extension work that we were doing with a conflict session, which was really fun, by the way, when we worked during COVID on Zoom with about 24 women and men who really wanted to get better at conflict. And I'm calling this today, this podcast, exactly the same name as your webinar, because I want people to go and Google this and find this podcast and find the University of Nebraska webinar that you did. And the webinar is called Farm Transition, Beginning Conversations About Finances. And yours was posted on April 13th, 2023. We'll put it in the show notes. Ours will be posted when this podcast becomes live and goes on YouTube. But I am a big supporter of the work you do because finances are a real stickler for farm transition. And I think you are very practical in your approach. I guess that's my kindred spirit feeling with you, that we're both trained in extension. So we both want to gather resources. So when you did that webinar, you were asking your audience what their biggest concerns were about finances and what have you found in your work?
Well, it's always fun to really kind of open up the chat and say, what are you afraid of? So on the owner side, what I hear a lot of is we might not be financially stable enough to retire. We're not sure that if we're not at the helm of this business, that it will succeed. And I hear, yeah. And then I also hear, we're really concerned about long-term care. And so those three really highlight some of those financial concerns on the owner side. On the heir side, they want to know that they can be financially independent. They want to know that they are not going to be at the kind of mercy of off-farm siblings. And they want to know all of the scenarios that could possibly happen if they come back to the farm or to the ranch business, and understanding what will happen under those scenarios. And all of those concerns really lean into having very transparent finances and having very open and honest conversations amongst farm and ranch families.
Then that's what I love about your webinar. So I really encourage people to go and seek that out after they've listened to this podcast, because you're very specific in your slides about what are the questions to ask. And I think that's where we want to go today, is the conversations that need to happen. And can you just quickly do your definition of owners, the sunset years, and heirs? Because I really also, because you understand agriculture, you know that farmers are typically never going to retire, or ranchers listen to this as well.
Yeah, and I think that can get confusing too. So when I teach, I like to talk about the owner generation. And the owner generation are people who own assets, farm or ranch assets, that expect to pass those assets and that business on at their death. Heirs can be on farm or off farm, and they expect to inherit assets. Now, I'll be the first to say I don't like the word expect, but I haven't come up with a better word yet. And then
that's right, expectations.
And then the final thing I like to talk about is sunset years. So when we talk about sunset years, we know that almost 80% of farmers and ranchers do not want to fully retire from farming or ranching. So with that, I call it sunsetting, right? So we need to still plan for that kind of end of life, whether that includes retirement or not. But I'd also like to point out sometimes we don't get to choose whether or not we retire. And so we still have to have some of those ideas of what happens if I step back from the day-to-day management and labor of this business.
So one of the things is you talk about having honest conversations. So why do you put honest in your descriptor of your questions? Because, people don't know what's going to happen at death typically, right? And you use the word expecting an inheritance. I think that's where the honesty part plays in. What do you think?
Yeah, so the reason that I like to kind of preface it with the word honest is I think sometimes we modify how we talk to each individual member of our family.
Okay.
And so we have to get real.
Mm-hmm.
And that owner generation in particular needs to be very, very clear about what will happen at their death, or disability, or divorce, or disagreement with a family member. Mm-hmm. That way, everybody else, all the stakeholders, all the heirs, has that understanding and then has those expectations of this is how it's going to go. But if you talk to your on-farm heirs and say, one day this will all be yours, but when the will is read, it's split 4 different ways, like it was for my uncle.
Big shockaroo.
Right. You have that moment of, number one, if I would have known that, I might not have come back to the operation. Number two, if I did know that and I did choose to come back, I might have handled my finances differently so that I was financially prepared to do a buyout or to work with my brothers and sisters in a different way. So that's why I preface those questions with honest. What are your honest plans?
Well, and when I watched your notes too on the webinar on farm transition, beginning conversations about finances, you had a very good point about the tools and tactics around the buying out the heirs. And I think that, and I use the word shockaroo because that I have bias around that, Jessica, because in my Finding Fairness in Farm Transition presentation, the F stands for financial transparency. And I also talk about, like you do, clarity of expectations and managing people's expectations. And I think, you in your comments at the end of the webinar said, your parents actually don't owe you anything. Wow. Some people don't like you, Jessica, and they don't like me either because we tell the truth. They don't. But where is it written that your parents do own you something? So when you're the on-farm heir and you want to get equity, what is your financial conversation with the owner for the heir around buyouts or getting a buy-sell agreement or something in place so that they can actually buy out their siblings if that's the expectation? Unfortunately, that is the expectation in many cases. And I just telling the world right now, I think that really is not fair because other people are doing just well, fine, thank you very much, without grabbing at farm assets. They can expect to get residue from the estate from the personal side, not tearing the farm apart. But anyway, that's my little sidetrack there. So what do you do? What is your recommendation for conversations about figuring this out if you have to buy out the siblings?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I recommend that heirs do not come back to the farm or ranch without something in writing.
Okay.
So that someday this will all be yours promise is not enough, right? So you need a clear picture of what the compensation package is for you to come back to the farm or ranch business. And then as that heir, as I consider that package, it can't just be enough to have the minimum standard of living. If I know that I'm ultimately going to be responsible for a buyout, we then have to be developing a plan to build enough wealth for that what if. And that's exactly what my spouse and I went through. It wasn't parents. Luckily, it was an aunt and an uncle. But we ended up buying out their operation. And the only way that we did that was because we had our own personal wealth outside of the existing business that we were then able to come in and do that buyout with. So I think there's kind of two things there. I think you have to build that wealth, but you also kind of have to build it in a way that you don't know when it's going to be used. We didn't know if that was going to be a 5-year wealth building journey or a 20-year wealth building journey. And for us, it was about 5. And so that was a really big thing for us to do. But we knew that we had that cushion there, that when the time was right, we could pull the trigger where other people our age in our 30s and our 40s couldn't. But part of that was because we had purposefully together as a couple said, this is coming down the pike, whether it's within our family or outside of our family, and we have to have, frankly, cash on hand for that opportunity to come forward. And for us, it ultimately was family. We bought into the family partnership, and we now live on the home place, and I don't think we change what we did. I know, we would do more wealth building if we could, and now we're in that process of rebuilding. So you just have to be in that place of, if that buyout is looming, what can I do for that? The other way to tackle that would to be looking at life insurance policies as well. And I actually have a new series of articles that are coming out this fall. Okay. You can check out, Elaine's going to link everything, but you can check out how to utilize life insurance policies under certain situations. And one of those is a potential, if you have a buy-sell agreement, backing that with a life insurance policy.
And also you mentioned in your webinar, making sure the person you're insuring is insurable, which becomes a problem with aging farmers, right? So I think part also related to this discussion, Jessica, is debt. And you and your husband really worked really hard over a short period of time to build some wealth to be able to access aunt and uncle's assets. My curiosity is, what have you seen in your 12 years of practice so far around having that hard debt conversation? Because I'm in my late 60s and I love it when I'm debt free for 3 or 4 months. And then something else happens. And I'm laughing, but we've been very blessed to be able to service and manage debt. But ultimately, I think older farmers get to an age where they say, hey, I don't want to take on any more debt. So what are you doing, young farmer, to manage this scenario? So how do you have those conversations about the debt?
Well, I don't know if you're familiar, but here in the U.S., we have a syndicated radio show. Okay. And one of the commentators on that radio show, one of his kind of phrases is that debt is dumb. Oh. And it breaks my heart every time I hear it.
His name would be Dave Ramsey, I'm suspecting.
Yeah.
You want to put it on the record? I'll put it on the record.
Okay, I'll let you put it on the record. Yeah. So he says debt is dumb. And every time I hear that, it breaks my heart. And here's why. Because debt is a tool.
Exactly.
Debt is a tool. So we can have good debt and we can have bad debt.
Exactly.
And so when I think about debt, what we want to do is we want to use good debt to advance us, and we want to minimize that bad debt. So here's some things that I think about. What is bad debt? Bad debt is relatively high interest rates.
Mhm.
If the item you purchased has a really short life compared to the amount of time it took you to pay off that debt. So if I'm putting groceries on a credit card and it's taking me 30, 60, or 90 days to pay off those groceries, right? The groceries are gone by the time I pay that credit card bill. So that would be a bad debt example. Another example of bad debt would be if the balance of the loan is greater than the value of the item that's been purchased. So that's when we call you being upside down in a
Right.
loan. And then the final one is if you went into debt for an item that wasn't necessary. Now, everybody has a different definition of what's
Like an
necessary.
$84,000 really fancy pickup truck? Is that what you mean?
Different people have different levels of necessary. For us, we're good with the 1995, $5,000 pickup. But if that's what you value, that's fine. But what we're looking for is minimizing that bad debt and looking for opportunities to look for that good debt. So relatively low interest rates, paying off that debt more quickly than the life of the item, and then also making sure that the balance of the loan is lower than the value of the asset. And then also there might be returns on that debt. So when I go into debt to purchase land, usually that land continues to appreciate in value. So there's those, yeah, so those are the things that we're looking at with debt. Now, when it comes to conversations with debt, we see that there's a generational difference in the attitudes towards debt. In our situation, my father-in-law is actually, Elaine, not too far off from you. He was in his late 60s. We're in our 30s and 40s. Should he have to go into debt for the land that he's farmed his entire life and already paid off once?
No, it doesn't want to buy it again.
Right. So we had that opportunity. We had that capability. Now, when it comes time to upgrade tractors and things like that, that's where the conversation becomes a little bit more difficult. And that's where, if that younger generation is in a solid financial position, if they don't have too much debt, which is another problem, even if it's good debt, right? We have to watch there's not too much there. But then we can start to say, okay, owner generation, if you're not willing to take on the debt, I am, as that younger generation or as that heir. So those are, again, those conversations that we have to have of, maybe it was that dad used to own all the equipment, but now we're going to start, as we retire that equipment out, that younger generation is going to start making those purchase decisions and taking on that debt so that that older generation isn't encumbered with that debt when they're 70, 80, and 90 years old.
Yeah, and I think a lot of young farmers are so longing, Jessica, because they long to own land. That's the best kind of debt and equity that they want to have access to. But unfortunately, now we're in 2024. We have, the ground in Nebraska. I remember when I was doing some research, it was over 10 grand an acre. The ground here is now 5 grand an acre, and closer to bean country or potato country, it goes up exponentially. So what is your encouragement to young farmers listening to this, to Eileen out running and to Anna and her farm? What kinds of financial conversations or tools, like in your webinar, you also talk about the income statement and the cash flow and the balance sheet being really important financial documents. So what have you seen around the conversation of keeping the books and financial transparency? Because keeping the books is, I think, also needs your definition.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things when we're dealing with farm families and finances that I definitely look for. So number one, are you everyone willing to share the financials of the business and good financial documents? So you mentioned those 3 primary financial documents: the balance sheet, the cash flow, and the income statement. Then we have to get to more personal discussions, because we can't have
personal finances.
I would really like them to at least be able to say, this is how much I need to generate from this farm or ranch business to have a viable standard of living.
Yes, I do too.
Yep. And then we have to be ready, willing, and able to create a viable standard of living for both owners and heirs.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, you have to balance both of those. And if a family's not willing to bring that together, we have a problem. So let's go through those 3 financial documents really fast and why we like to look at all 3 when we're talking about transition. So a balance sheet is going to be a list of everything that the business owns, which we call assets, and everything it owes, which is liabilities or debt. So this is really important when we're just talking about what do we own? Land, cattle, equipment, etc. And then what's the debt associated with it? Next, we're going to look at the cash flow over a few different years, and that shows us items that don't show up as debt on that balance sheet. So do you have lease agreements? Do you have family living withdrawals? Those kinds of things that just get pulled out of the business. And then finally, we have to look at those documents together and we kind of consolidate them into an income statement. And that income statement shows the profitability of the business. I honestly...
Both profit and loss statements too.
Yep, you can call it a profit and loss statement or an income statement. And honestly, your balance sheet and your cash flow don't tell me enough to tell me whether or not we can bring another family unit into that farm or that ranch operation. So that income statement is the last statement that we have to take extra steps to make sure that it's done correctly. But that's where we say, are we able to pay our taxes? Are we able to pay the principal payments of debt? Are we able to support these family units?
And Jessica, back in the day when I used to sit shoulder to shoulder with Manitoba agriculture farm management specialists, which was long decades ago, they used to have a number where they would say, if you're going to bring another person into your farm or your ranch, you need to have, say, $500,000 worth of gross sales. So do you have a number now in Nebraska that gives you some degree of comfort when people are asking you, what's the viability look like? So what does that number look like now in the U.S. and Nebraska?
So I don't have a gross sales number, but I do have a family living expense number in 2020. Yeah, in 2023, Nebraska Farm Business Incorporated, which does our benchmarking as a part of USDA, said that it took $116,000 for the average farm family's living expenses.
That's giving me goosebumps right now.
And that number between 2013 and 2023 ranged between 86 and that 116.
Okay.
Now, let's pause there. Let's take a deep breath. Because remember that for some farm and ranch operations, the farm's not the only place where we are contributing to family living expenses. And we know that family living expenses tend to inflate in the good years and retract in the not so good years. So I had a banker I was teaching about family living expenses a few weeks ago, and he said, we estimate about $25,000 per adult plus $10,000 per kid. So using those numbers, you can kind of start to formulate kind of where we're at. And then you can look at what are my sources of off-farm income that contribute to family living. And so that can really help start to gauge what's happening. And a lot of farm and ranch families remember the 1980s. And so we still see that there is a lot of them that have either side businesses, whether that's a seed dealership, or they have some sort of off-farm income, one of the spouses.
Operation, yeah.
Right, does those kinds of things. So I think we have to take that with the understanding of every situation is different. Finances are very personal, and that's a situation where we need to look at our own numbers. But if you haven't looked at your numbers, I highly encourage you to go through and look at how much it actually costs you to live, especially where groceries are at right now. I think you'd be surprised if you're not tracking that carefully, that it's probably higher than, 50, 75. Yeah. Than what you think.
And I remember some stats from South Dakota and the University of Minnesota too that were around $84,000. And we have a global audience. There's people listening to this, Jessica, from Australia and Ireland and South Africa. And in Canada, I just bought some British pounds because I'm going to speak in the UK, and the exchange was 1.85. I bought some euros The exchange was 1.5. And then I bought, American dollars, are you kidding me? Is a 1.3. Like there's this bump too, right, between countries as to what that number is going to look like. But I think what you're saying and what I totally am in alignment with is when you can talk about family living. I asked my son point blank, I said, Ian, what are you and Kendra spending on family living? And it's not mom, the mother-in-law, being nosy. It's just an idea of what is the draw necessary from the farm business. And in our case, it's a joint venture. And I think that's wise. So the other thing that struck me about your webinar that I thought was fascinating is explain to me mine, yours, and ours in terms of where yes, in terms of where the money is coming from. Because I remember coaching this farm family once where one of the owners was writing secret checks for $5,000 to another sibling living in the city because they weren't very good with money. And I'm just going, oh my goodness, this is an ongoing volcanic event about to happen. So explain that, what's important about how you keep the accounts when you are in a farm transition. And again, just like you came back to the farm with a written agreement with uncle, what's good practice for bank accounts?
Yeah. So I personally actually don't have a preference of what you do. I just want to know that you know what you're going to do before getting there. So the first option is to have two separate accounts, a your account and a my account. And we're going to split expenses between those accounts. So in our example, dad would have an account and my husband would have an account, and we would be splitting expenses equally between those expenses. Now, that becomes difficult sometimes. I think suppliers are a lot better than they used to be. I'll just, be frank. But that requires you to go in and say, this is split. This half the bill goes here and this half of the bill goes here. So that's kind of that option one. I like that option because it keeps finances separate and it keeps that opportunity for you to look at your own accounts and know what's going on. On the other side of that, there's the our account method, which is we're both going to put in an equivalent amount, or based on our shares, an amount of money into an account, and everything is going to be paid out of that account. I like that. Yeah, I like that setup for a farm account because it's more simple for our suppliers, right? Bill goes one location, somebody writes the check, we know that everything's paid. But to your point, if you don't have access to that account, that can be very, very frustrating.
Oh man, and that causes a lot of conflict too. I mean, people who are 50 years old who still can't write checks, that just blows me away. Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, you're fine. I think no matter which way you go, it's just really having an understanding and not getting lazy about it. And that's the truth.
Right. And so part of this, where is it written that only women do farm books?
Oh, don't get me started, Elaine.
Oh, I want to get you started because I want to hear your opinion. That's why I asked you.
Oh, so
I will never and have never done the farm books because that on my behavior, my personal style indicator, my attention to cognitive detail is my lowest score. So I went out and started writing grain news articles 3 decades ago. 30 years I've been doing this as an off-farm cash flow. I said, hire a bookkeeper. This will not be me.
So I think it's a double-edged sword to some extent. I feel like as the woman in the situation, I felt like it was a way for me to contribute to the operation in a meaningful way. It also helped me understand what the level of expenses are. I mean, when you're writing $100,000 plus, checks, you start to get used to, this is the quantity of numbers and the size of numbers that we're working with. So I think there's some benefits for someone within the operation to be doing some of those lower level bookkeeping tasks. However, we need to make sure that they want to do it, that they have time to do it, and that they are capable of doing it.
And that they're current too, because a big problem Jessica, when I'm coaching farm families, is Elaine, the books are behind. They're not timely. And that's costing dollars too, right? That's a higher expense to the family. And so that I also thought that was interesting, just in terms of when we were all talking about all these different dimensions. So in farm transition, Jessica, where have you seen it work well when said mother, owner, decides at 65, I don't want to do this anymore? So what's a good transition plan for sharing the books, turning the books over, training the new books? Because in our case, in our farm, we outsource the bookkeeping. But the people, obviously my successor son and farming husband in his sunset years are both very aware. And I come in to the annual accounting meeting when the benchmarks are given, and I get to read the financial statements once a year because I just want to be kept in the loop. And I want to know, are we in the green or are we in the red? Like, where are we at sort of cash flow wise? So what's a good strategy for being proactive, which you and your husband are, to help people make that transition of older generation doing the books to younger generation? Because I think a lot of people really struggle with control and letting go of the finances.
So I think it's the same advice we would give you if you were going to be the one who was going out and making the purchase decisions, the agronomy decisions or the livestock feeding decisions, right? So what I would like to say is, first of all, don't get so frustrated you just want to throw them away.
Yeah, I'm just going to quit tomorrow.
Right. So if you're starting to say, this is something that I'm ready, willing, and able to give up, start having those conversations in those family business meetings of, I would like you to start to learn, what does bookkeeping mean in our family? What are the exact tasks that I do? And then start bringing those heirs, especially, along to meetings with, if you have a professional bookkeeper, an accountant, an attorney, so that they understand what kind of information is being drawn from those documents, what kind of questions are being asked, and what you're ultimately getting at the end of that. I think sometimes it's the default of, well, we just have numbers on a page. And we have to get to that moment where we are digging deeper into those documents and really understanding what they're saying, not just, there's X number of dollars in the bank account. Well, that doesn't tell me a whole lot.
And I've also heard owners say, I don't want my daughter-in-law to know how much we're really worth. And I go, are you kidding me? Because that's like cutting off your right arm or a branch of the family tree. And those branches don't go back on once they're sawed off. So it's very interesting that you and I are very much aligned, I think, in our value system about honesty and openness and matching the right skill set with the right person. Like, I have a coaching client. She's a AA personality. That's her own self-description. But she has spreadsheets for everything, and she's amazing. And I just go, I am not you. I cannot do this part. And the other thing that I think is that people are also concerned about confidentiality within the community. And I think that's just a family discussion about, what are our expectations here when we do discuss finances? It's confidential. How soon should people be taking their teenager to the accountant, Jessica? How do you develop those relationships?
Oh, it's funny. I see 14-year-olds that can handle it and 40-year-olds that can't. So I think that's more of a
mature thing. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's more of a maturity thing. But I mean, think of how powerful that would have been if you were 14 and 15 years old, kind of understanding that this is how much this costs. Dad's mad at you because you just wrecked it, whatever that.
Corner a little short, and that tire was $1,500 to replace on that grain cart.
Right.
I don't know the exact number of the grain cart tire.
Right.
Yes.
But those kinds of lessons get reinforced when we start putting dollar amounts behind it, because it's not just you messed up. It's that you messed up and there are more consequences to that. And then when we're ready to hand over the full reins of the operation, they understand those consequences, and how they handle financial situations, and they've built relationships with those service providers. Right. It's a totally different ballgame when they've been there all along.
Well, and I think for some of the spouses who aren't involved in every day of the ranch and the farm, many of them have said, Elaine, I don't need to know all the minutiae. I just need the big picture. Are we a successful farm? Do we pay our debts on time? And I just want to be kept in the loop. So that, I think, too, is managing expectations. So one of the most fascinating things I saw in the work that you've done, Jessica, is your stress test. So explain to me what that is and how that works, because I've used index cards and just wrote what if. What if Wes dies? And, my sister died at the hands of a drunk driver when she was 23. My mother died of an asthma attack in the middle of harvest at 65. So in my life story, I'm very familiar that the old don't die first necessarily. So tell our listeners about the stress test and how that helps with planning.
Yeah, so we do retreats here at the University of Nebraska where we bring farm and ranch families together to start their estate plans and their transition plans. And what we do, and it's very hard to do, is we ask them to write everybody's name on a sticky note or on an index card, and we put it in a hat. And we spend an hour or two together, and we pull names out of that hat and say, based on what you currently know and what you understand about your estate plan, if something happens to this person, does your estate plan still work? Does your transition plan still work? Does your business plan still work? And as we go through that process, I think a lot of times people start to realize, oh, that's a bigger issue than we thought it would be. And no, it doesn't address it. So that's the stress testing that we do. So again, index cards and a baseball cap, write everybody's name on it, toss them in a hat and pull them out randomly and see, does it still work if something happens? The other thing I'd like to emphasize with that is it's not just death. It's disability, divorce, bankruptcy, disagreement. For whatever reason, if they have to leave the farm or the ranch operation, does the plan still work under each of those scenarios? Death is not the only way that people depart farms and ranches.
And disability was a close call for us too when my husband, 7 years this October, crashed his pickup truck on a grid road where both people thought they had the right of way, and it was a pretty big crash. And it was thank goodness he has no long-lasting effects from said accident. But what it did for our family is it activated our power of attorney, which we had in place for our son. And I think it also really upped the maturity timeline too for our son to say, hey, I've got to run this farm pretty much on the boots on the ground kind of thing for the next 3 months, while Wes's 13 fractures in his rib were healing. So I don't wish that on any farm family, that tragedy or an accident or something motivates them to do this work. So Jessica, you have some great questions here for off-farm heirs that I had put in an earlier article that I wrote. And this is for off-farm heirs, because I don't think we've dealt with them a whole lot. And I'm pretty sure there's some advisors listening to this podcast who are advisors because they were not wanted or able in terms of viability to go back to their own farms. So the questions you ask are, how, if at all, do you expect to be involved in the farm business? What do you want your relationship to be? When will that involvement begin? How does that fit with your current off-farm lifestyle? Do you expect, and here's the key question I think is golden that you ask, do you expect to receive compensations for this involvement? And if so, what type? Cash, house, utilities, beef, salary, insurance, retirement plans, grain, calves, shares of entity, percent of land ownership? And do you expect to receive assets from owners either while they are living or at death? And when an heir joins the operation, are they expected to contribute money to the operation? So this is a fascinating set of questions that I wanted to put on our podcast, because where do you see the conflict ignite between the successor heir who comes back like you and your husband have done with uncle's blessing to do that, versus the ones who are just always trying to jockey for position as off-farm heirs, and no one has been honest enough to say, we would love you to be here, but there's no viability to support 2 heirs. We can only have 1 successor. Tell me about that.
So I'll be honest, those questions were the questions I wish I would have asked during our family's first family meeting. Okay. So the question that was asked at our family's first family meeting was, do you want to see this farm continue? And everybody went around the room and said yes.
Okay. Rah.
And I'm the daughter-in-law who has all this training going, and follow it up. And those questions weren't asked. And so honestly, Elaine, our transition from uncle to us required us to ask those questions of cousins, and they didn't have answers.
Yeah. And did you give them a timeline, Jessica? Because I hate that when I ask someone, what is your expectation about coming back to the farm? And then they drop their head and they say, I don't know. I said, and then as a coach, I say, and when will you know? Because I need to know by next Tuesday.
Right. And so those questions are, again, probably more of what I now use when I work with families, rather than what we were able to do.
Well, and Jessica, you and I know full well that when we deal with other extension people, or in an audience of 300 women or 400 men and women, there are the 400 stories.
Mm-hmm.
There are always stories, right?
Yeah.
So, excuse me, I just need a drink here. So if you were going to give your top 3 recommendations, the things you really need to pay attention that are going to make a significant difference to help families embrace financial transparency, not worry about the daughter-in-law yakking to the neighbors what the price of how much they paid for the combine. I think these next gens, the age of my son, these 30-year-olds, they tell everything. They share a lot more than my generation does, the boomers. My granddaughters love to call me a boomer. I don't know why that is, but anyway, so I'm a boomer. But for the next gens, I think what they're doing is they're also using financial transparency between farms as a peer networking system, right? Because they want to know, are we out of line here? Is this reasonable? Just even the number you dropped today with the family living number being between 86,000 US or 116,000. That's not unreal. That's legit. So you are an extension ag economist. You've seen all kinds of Nebraska scenarios. What are the 3 key things people want to take away today around financial transparency?
Number 1, be honest. Be honest with your expectations. Number 2, even if numbers aren't your thing, right? I'm the economist. Numbers geek me out. I enjoy it. Try to do what you do, Elaine, and get in and get enough information so that you are at least confident that you have enough information. And number 3, make sure that you're ready, willing, and able to put all of the options on the table. And sometimes as we work with farm and ranch families, they want to exclude certain options because they've made assumptions about how people are going to react or how it's really going to play out. And when we're talking about finances, sometimes we have to make really, really hard decisions that will catapult us into the future and make us viable. And so we have to leave those options on the table, which includes selling land, which includes renting out land, which includes not allowing everybody to come back. And so that openness really has to be a part of these conversations as well.
And I think there's a book that was written for children that says, I wish I could take you to Disneyland or Disney World. That sounds like a really nice thing to do. But according to our cash flow, we can't afford to go to the hotel in the next town and have a water slide. So again, saying I wish I could, but the finances and the data tells me that this is what our parameters are. So I just want to thank you, Jessica. I really admire the work you do. And just as we close, can you tell our listeners about CAPS, about the resources that the University of Nebraska has, and what's the best thing to Google to find them? We'll put some in the show notes too.
So the University of Nebraska has the Center for Ag Profitability, which is the team that, the team that I work on. So that's cap.unl.edu. We do a free webinar every Thursday at noon Central Time, so you can always catch the latest information from us on that. And we have a backlog since 2020 of all the webinars that we have done. I'm really excited. This fall, we're going to be doing a family living workshop that will be online as well as in person. If you're here in Nebraska, we'd love for you to join us. And you can also follow me on Instagram, Jessica_Groskopf, and I share a lot of that there as well.
That's perfect. So thank you, folks, for spending this time. And again, good debt, bad debt. Think about what you're spending your money on, and don't be afraid to talk about money. I think we've had a great conversation today, and it really helps me make my heart sing that there are different tools that you can put into practice now to have better financial transparency on your farms, which means better communication, better understanding, and then guess what? You'll all find harmony because now you understand. We'll see you next time. Thanks for this. Bye for now.